From Ultimate Warrior locked in an airtight casket facing death, to Kurt Angle choked out on a plane and hiding for weeks, and Randy Orton frozen in terror as Taker rose from flames. In this video, we're counting down the WWE legends who were absolutely terrified of The Undertaker. One of them was paralyzed with fear despite running the entire company. Ultimate Warrior. Alright, so we're kicking things off with a bang, and I mean that literally because we're talking about the Ultimate Warrior. Now, the Warrior was known for being this intense, high-energy, completely unpredictable force of nature who feared nothing and nobody, right? Wrong. During their 1991 feud, things got absolutely insane. Picture this. Warrior gets ambushed on the funeral parlor set, and we're not talking about just a regular beatdown. Nah, The Undertaker and Jake the Snake Roberts literally locked this man inside an airtight casket and just left him there for dead. Like, that's some horror movie type stuff right there. The psychological warfare was on another level entirely, and Warrior himself admitted in shoot interviews later on that this whole experience taught him what real fear felt like. He called it a career-defining nightmare, which is wild coming from a guy who built his whole character around being fearless and unstoppable. The casket match between these two became legendary not just for the action, but for how genuinely unsettling it was. Even though Warrior eventually confronted this fear head-on like the warrior he was, the fact remains that The Undertaker got into his head in a way that nobody else in the business ever could. That's just the power of the dead man, fam. Now let's switch gears and talk about someone who you'd think would be absolutely fearless. Kurt Angle. Olympic gold medalist, one of the toughest competitors to ever grace a wrestling ring, right? Well, even this man got humbled real quick when he messed with The Undertaker. So here's what went down on the infamous 2002 plane ride from hell, and this story is absolutely wild. Kurt Angle, probably feeling himself a little too much, thought it would be funny to wrestle Vince McMahon for real on the plane. But here's where he messed up big time. In all the commotion, he ended up waking up The Undertaker, who was trying to sleep. Now, if you know anything about Taker's reputation backstage, you know he was basically the locker room enforcer, the guy who kept everyone in line, and you absolutely did not want to be on his bad side. So what does Taker do? He straight up chokes out Kurt Angle right there on the plane. And we're not talking about some playful chokehold. This was the real deal. Angle detailed in his autobiography that he was genuinely terrified afterward and actually avoided The Undertaker for weeks following this incident, despite all his Olympic gold medal toughness and amateur wrestling credentials. Think about that for a second. A legit Olympic champion was scared to even be in the same vicinity as Taker after that encounter. That's the kind of respect mixed with absolute fear that The Undertaker commanded backstage. Coming up next, we've got Randy Orton. The legend killer himself, third-generation superstar who made his name by taking out WWE legends left and right. But even the Viper couldn't escape the terror of The Undertaker. In 2005, Orton had what seemed like a massive victory when he and his father Bob Orton managed to defeat Taker in a casket match. Randy was feeling himself, probably thinking he just ended the dead man's mystique once and for all. But oh boy, was he wrong. At Survivor Series that same year, the arena went completely dark, and then it happened. The Undertaker literally rose from a flaming casket, flames shooting everywhere, smoke filling the arena, and Orton's face told the entire story. He was absolutely frozen in pure terror, standing there like he'd just seen an actual ghost come back for revenge. And you know what the craziest part is? Orton admitted later on The Miz and Mrs. Show that the flames and that sudden emergence from the casket gave him chills for weeks afterward. We're talking about a guy who's supposed to be this cold, calculated predator, and he couldn't shake off the fear that The Undertaker instilled in him. The whole Viper versus dead man dynamic became something entirely different after that moment, because Randy realized that you don't just beat The Undertaker and walk away clean. The Phenom always finds a way to get his revenge, and it's usually more terrifying than anything you could imagine. Let's keep this momentum rolling and talk about Chris Jericho. Y2J himself, one of the most accomplished and confident wrestlers to ever lace up a pair of boots. But even Jericho wasn't immune to the intimidation factor of The Undertaker, and this story from 2008 is absolutely insane. So apparently Jericho tried to get out of a match by claiming he was injured, which in wrestling terms is a pretty big no-no, especially when you're scheduled to face someone as important as The Undertaker. Now, Taker served as the unofficial locker room enforcer, the guy who made sure everyone was pulling their weight polite and not disrespecting the business. When he caught wind of Jericho trying to duck out of their match, he didn't just have a conversation about it. Nah, The Undertaker literally hurled a battery at Chris Jericho to convince him to wrestle. Like, imagine being in that locker room and seeing this 6'10" dead man figure just chuck a battery at you because you tried to call in sick. Jericho recounted on his podcast being absolutely scared out of his mind during this whole ordeal, and you could hear in his voice how genuine that fear was. This story really highlights how The Undertaker's unspoken authority backstage was just as powerful, if not more powerful, than anything he did in the ring. Nobody questioned him, nobody challenged him, and if you stepped out of line, you were gonna deal with the consequences real quick. Now we're shifting to talk about someone who wasn't a wrestler, but still experienced absolute terror at the hands of The Undertaker, Stephanie McMahon. In 1999, during the Ministry of Darkness storyline, wrestling got dark in ways we'd never really seen before on WWE television. The Undertaker was leading this cult-like group, and their whole mission seemed to be causing chaos and controlling the WWE. Things reached peak insanity when Stephanie was literally kidnapped by Undertaker's ministry and subjected to this forced, dark wedding ritual that was supposed to symbolize Taker's complete takeover of the company. Now, here's where it gets real. Vince McMahon himself revealed in documentaries that this storyline actually terrified Stephanie on set. Like, the lines between acting and genuine fear got completely blurred. And honestly, can you blame her? You've got The Undertaker in full dead man mode, this massive, intimidating presence, performing these creepy rituals while you're tied up and helpless. The whole ministry era was designed to be unsettling, but for Stephanie, it hit different because she was right there in the middle of it all, experiencing Taker's intensity up close and personal. Vince admitted that watching his daughter go through that storyline was genuinely difficult because the fear in her eyes wasn't entirely manufactured. That's just how committed The Undertaker was to his character. He stayed in that dead man persona so completely that even people who knew it was a show couldn't help but feel genuinely unnerved by his presence. Alright, so let's talk about Big Show. Also known as Paul White, a literal giant standing 7 feet tall and weighing over 400 pounds. You'd think someone that massive would be intimidated by absolutely nothing, right? Wrong again. When Big Show first came to WWE in 1999 as a rookie, he quickly learned that size meant nothing when it came to The Undertaker's authority backstage. Here's the tea. Show was constantly being called out by Taker for botching spots and making mistakes in the ring, which is normal for rookies. But when The Undertaker is the one correcting you, it hits completely different. Paul White shared on Talk Is Jericho that those early scoldings from Taker left him absolutely scared stiff in the locker rooms. Like, imagine being 7 feet tall and still feeling small because The Undertaker is staring you down and telling you that you messed up. White said those initial encounters felt like facing a real-life monster, not just another wrestler trying to help him improve. The fear was so genuine that it took years for Big Show to get over that initial intimidation and develop the mutual respect that they eventually had. The backstage dynamics between them were intense in those early days, with Show genuinely afraid of disappointing Taker or making another mistake that would earn him another dressing down. Eventually, that fear evolved into respect, and they had some incredible matches together, but Big Show never forgot those early days when The Undertaker made him feel like a scared rookie despite his massive size advantage. Speaking of family dynamics, let's dive into the complicated relationship between The Undertaker and his on-screen half-brother, Kane. Now, their storyline was built on years of psychological warfare and supernatural elements that blurred the lines between kayfabe and reality in the most unsettling ways. In 2003, Kane did the unthinkable. He buried The Undertaker alive, which should have been the end of the dead man's reign of terror. But here's where things got genuinely creepy for Glenn Jacobs, the man behind the Kane mask. After burying Taker alive, Kane started experiencing what the storyline portrayed as guilt and supernatural visions, like his brother was haunting him from beyond the grave. Then at Royal Rumble 2004, that iconic bell started tolling, and you could see genuine visible fear on Kane's face even through the mask. The whole arena knew what that bell meant. The Undertaker was coming back, and he was coming for revenge. Jacobs later admitted in podcasts that the psychological warfare of this storyline made it feel personally haunting, like the character work was getting into his actual head. The build-up to Taker's return at WrestleMania Dex was masterfully done because it played on real fears of consequences and revenge. Even though Kane was also portrayed as a supernatural monster, there was always this understanding that The Undertaker was on another level entirely. The original dead man who couldn't truly be killed or buried. Their matches were always intense, but this particular storyline stands out because of how genuinely unsettled Kane appeared throughout the whole thing. Let's keep this train rolling and talk about CM Punk. The self-proclaimed best in the world, straight-edge superstar who built his career on being defiant and refusing to sell for anyone. But even Punk couldn't maintain that tough guy persona when facing The Undertaker during their 2008-2009 feuds. What made this so notable was that Punk literally prided himself on no selling and staying in character no matter what. But The Undertaker's mid-match sit-ups broke through that armor every single time. Like you could see the wide-eyed panic on Punk's face, especially after their Hell in a Cell match when Taker did that signature rise from the dead move. The way Punk sold the terror was so genuine and visceral that it became one of the defining aspects of their feud. And you know what the wildest part is? After Punk retired, he actually tweeted about how facing The Undertaker gave him feelings of pure terror, admitting that despite all his bravado and confidence, he couldn't help but feel genuinely unnerved by Taker's presence in those supernatural moments. For a guy who made his name by being cocky and fearless, that's a pretty massive admission. The Undertaker had this unique ability to get into opponents' heads, and Punk, for all his psychological games and mind tricks, found himself on the receiving end of mental warfare from the absolute master. Their matches were classics not just because of the wrestling, but because of how well Punk conveyed genuine fear and uncertainty when dealing with the Phenom. Now, moving on next is Triple H. The game himself, 14-time world champion, one of the most dominant forces in WWE history. But even Hunter had his moments of genuine terror when dealing with The Undertaker. Despite their later legendary rivalry, the early interactions between them, especially during the 2001 Invasion angle, showed Triple H visibly recoiling in shock whenever Taker did those signature sit-ups. Like, we're talking about a guy who's supposed to be this cerebral assassin, this master strategist who never gets caught off guard, and yet, every single time The Undertaker did that unnatural rise from a seemingly unconscious state, Hunter would freeze up completely. Paul Levesque admitted in WWE Untold that those sit-ups legitimately froze him every single time, and it wasn't entirely acting. There was genuine awe and a touch of fear mixed in there. The way Triple H described it, watching someone who should be knocked out suddenly sit straight up with that dead man stare was both impressive from a physical standpoint and genuinely unsettling psychologically. Their WrestleMania matches later became some of the greatest in history, but those early encounters established the dynamic that even someone as accomplished and confident as Triple H recognized that The Undertaker operated on a different level. The respect was always there, but so was this underlying acknowledgement that messing with the dead man could lead to consequences that went beyond just losing a match. Hunter sold the fear perfectly, making Taker look like an unstoppable supernatural force, even to one of WWE's top stars. Next on the list is John Cena. The face of the company for over a decade, Mr. Hustle Loyalty, Respect Himself. Now, Cena built his entire character around never giving up, never backing down, and overcoming impossible odds no matter what. But even John Cena had to bow down to the mystique of The Undertaker. In 2010 at Elimination Chamber, something wild happened that wrestling fans still talk about to this day. Cena was in the middle of the match doing his usual Superman routine, and then The Undertaker did his signature sit-up. And for one of the few times in his career, you could see Cena's whole hustle, loyalty, respect persona completely break down as he backed away in what looked like genuine horror. Like, this is John Cena we're talking about. The guy who kicked out of everything, who never sold fear for anyone. And yet there he was, retreating from The Undertaker like he'd just seen a ghost. Cena later joked about it on The Tonight Show, saying it was legitimately scary, but wrestling forums and fans noted how important that moment was for amplifying the dead man's mystique even among the new generation of stars. Even though Cena was being positioned as the top guy in the company, that moment reminded everyone that there were still levels to this, and The Undertaker was on a completely different plane of existence in terms of his aura and presence. The fact that Cena sold it so well made it even more impactful. Now let's talk about a moment that's equal parts embarrassing and terrifying for the person involved. Matt Hardy's infamous botch at Survivor Series 2005. Matt Hardy. So here's what went down. The Undertaker was making his big return to WWE, and the whole moment was supposed to be this huge deal with Taker delivering a chokeslam to Matt Hardy as part of the dramatic comeback. Sounds simple enough, right? Wrong. Hardy completely botched the spot by literally fleeing the ring during what was supposed to be a planned chokeslam. And in front of thousands of fans and millions watching at home, the whole sequence fell apart. Now, if you know anything about The Undertaker's reputation backstage, you know that he did not tolerate people messing up his moments, especially not during something as important as his return. Hardy earned himself a very public dressing down from Taker, and the humiliation was real. Matt actually posted on Reddit years later on the Squared Circle subreddit about how the whole experience was absolutely terrifying for him, and he genuinely feared that this one mistake had completely ended his push in the company. Like, imagine being in the ring, botching a spot with The Undertaker of all people, and then having to face the consequences backstage knowing that you just disrespected one of the most respected figures in wrestling history. The fear wasn't just about the physical confrontation, it was about knowing that you disappointed someone whose approval and respect meant everything in the locker room. Hardy's career continued after this, but he never forgot the terror of that moment and the very real possibility that The Undertaker could have ended his career with just a word to management. Moving right along to another fascinating story, let's talk about Edge, the rated R superstar, the ultimate opportunist who built his Hall of Fame career on being crafty, cunning, and absolutely fearless in pursuing championships. Edge. Even Edge had his moment of genuine terror when dealing with The Undertaker. In 2006, during their intense feud, there was this moment where Edge was teaming against Taker, and when The Undertaker did one of his surprise rise-ups from what should have been a knockout blow, Edge completely froze in the ring, his mouth literally hanging open in shock and fear. Now, for a guy who made his career on being quick-thinking and always having a plan, that moment of complete vulnerability was striking. Adam Copeland talked about it later on ENC's Pod of Awesomeness, describing the experience as genuinely soul-shaking because his whole rated R superstar persona and ego suddenly clashed with Taker's otherworldly aura in a way he wasn't prepared for. Their matches, including that legendary TLC encounter, were incredible from a pure wrestling standpoint, but what made them special was how Edge managed to portray both confidence and underlying fear when dealing with the Phenom. There was always this sense that no matter how many mind games Edge played or how many tricks he pulled out of his sleeve, The Undertaker was operating on a level that transcended normal wrestling psychology. Edge sold that terror beautifully, making their feud feel like more than just another championship rivalry. It felt like Edge was genuinely in over his head, dealing with something supernatural. JBL. Let's shift gears and talk about JBL, John Bradshaw Layfield, the wrestling god himself who held the WWE Championship for nearly a year. Now, JBL was known for being legitimately tough outside of the ring, a real-life brawler who didn't back down from anyone. But even he knew better than to mess with The Undertaker when gold was on the line. During their 2004 title feud, JBL understood that Taker's hunting mode was absolutely lethal, and his only chance of survival was to cheat at every possible opportunity. At SummerSlam, JBL barely escaped with his championship through nefarious means, but then came the last ride match at No Mercy, where the rules heavily favored The Undertaker's supernatural abilities and brutal style. JBL shared on his podcast that the fear he portrayed wasn't entirely acting. Taker's real-life toughness and reputation made the threat feel completely authentic. He literally said that you don't mess with the dead man when championships are involved, because Taker had this way of making you feel like your career was on the line with every single encounter. The last ride match became legendary not just for the brutality, but for how JBL managed to convey genuine concern and fear while still maintaining his cocky heel persona. It was a delicate balance. He needed to look scared enough that Taker seemed like an unstoppable force, but not so scared that he looked weak as champion. JBL pulled it off perfectly, and their feud remains one of the most memorable of Taker's championship pursuits. Yokozuna. Now we're going old school, fam, talking about Yokozuna, the massive Samoan wrestler who was literally billed as being unafraid of anything and anyone. This dude was a mountain of a man, a dominant force who crushed opponents with his size and power. But even Yokozuna showed uncharacteristic fear when dealing with The Undertaker. At 1993 Survivor Series, Yokozuna was the last man standing against Taker, and despite his size advantage and dominant positioning in the company, he showed genuine hesitation that was was completely out of character for him. He needed massive interference just to retain his title, which told the story that even this unstoppable force recognized something different about The Undertaker. Then came their 1994 casket rematch at Royal Rumble, where Yokozuna's panic at Taker's return became one of the most memorable moments of that era. Wrestling forums like WrestleZone still talk about his wide-eyed flight reaction as peak kayfabe fear from the sumo legend. What made this so impactful was that Yokozuna was being positioned as this unstoppable monster heel, someone who showed no emotion except anger and dominance. Yet The Undertaker brought out visible fear in him. It added layers to both characters. Taker looked even more dangerous because he could terrify someone as massive as Yokozuna, and Yokozuna's character became more interesting because we saw vulnerability that we'd never seen before. Their matches were spectacles not just because of the size difference, but because of the psychological storytelling. Alright, so this next story is wild because it involves someone who wasn't even a full-time wrestler. Teddy Long, the legendary referee and SmackDown general manager. In 2009, after Teddy refereed a controversial submission match where The Undertaker didn't tap out but the match result was disputed, Taker decided it was time to send a message to the zebra-striped official. What happened next was straight out of a horror movie. The Undertaker literally kidnapped Teddy Long on SmackDown, putting him in a limousine and driving off into the night as revenge for the controversial call. Now, here's the thing that makes this story even crazier. Teddy Long recounted in interviews that he was genuinely spooked by the whole experience, not just because of what was happening on camera, but because of The Undertaker's commitment to staying in character. Long said Taker's unblinking stare and the isolation of being in that limo with the dead man made it his scariest WWE moment by far. Like, imagine being Teddy Long, someone who's been around wrestling for decades, and still feeling legitimately unnerved, because The Undertaker is in full character mode just staring at you without saying a word. That's psychological torture right there, and it shows how committed Taker was to maintaining his aura, even in segments that could have easily been played for laughs. Instead, it was genuinely unsettling television that had fans worried about Teddy Long's safety, even though everyone knew it was scripted. That's the power of The Undertaker's presence and character work. Let's talk about one of the most memorable examples of pure kayfabe terror: Kamala, the Ugandan giant, a character who was supposed to be this savage, fearless warrior from the depths of Africa. But when he was put into a program with The Undertaker in 1992, something magical happened in terms of storytelling. Kamala literally ran away from The Undertaker across multiple arenas. The gimmick that Undertaker was playing genuinely made Kamala bolt in panic sometimes. Like, the man behind the Kamala character, who you'd think would be completely aware it's all a work, was reduced to pure fear when dealing with The Undertaker. It elevated both characters. Taker looked unstoppable and genuinely supernatural, while Kamala's fear made him seem more human and relatable despite the wild, savage gimmick. These are the kind of story beats that made early 90s WWE so memorable. Diesel. Now let's talk about Diesel, also known as Kevin Nash, the 7-foot-tall bad guy who was supposed to be cool, confident, and completely unshakable. But on the road to WrestleMania 13, The Undertaker found a way to get under Diesel's skin in the most psychologically disturbing way possible. There was this legendary segment where Paul Bearer wheeled out a casket, and when it opened, it contained a mirror image of Diesel himself, basically a symbol of his own mortality and the death that The Undertaker represented. Then things got even wilder when Taker literally dragged Diesel under the ring into what was portrayed as a nightmare realm, a journey into darkness that Diesel couldn't escape from. Kevin Nash later called this whole experience existential terror in WWE Legends documentaries, admitting that the storyline played on his real-life aversion to confined spaces and feelings of claustrophobia. Like, think about how effective that is as storytelling. They found a real psychological fear that Nash had and incorporated it into the character work to make everything feel more authentic and unsettling. The under-ring segments were simple in execution, but absolutely brilliant in terms of their psychological impact. Wrestling fans of that era still remember those moments because they felt genuinely different and creepy compared to the usual WWE fare. Diesel was a cool character, but The Undertaker stripped away all that coolness and exposed the fear underneath, which made their WrestleMania encounter feel even more significant. We gotta talk about the boss himself, Vince McMahon, the man who literally owns and runs WWE, someone you'd think would be immune to fear since he's the one pulling all the strings behind the scenes. But even Vince wasn't safe from The Undertaker's reign of terror. Vince McMahon. In 1999, when Taker was leading the Ministry of Darkness, the storyline went to some genuinely dark places that made even the boss uncomfortable. The Ministry crucified Stone Cold Steve Austin on live television, and then they targeted Vince's own family, specifically kidnapping his daughter Stephanie in that forced wedding ceremony we talked about earlier. The whole thing left Vince paralyzed with fear on Raw, and what makes this so fascinating is that McMahon detailed in a WWE 24 episode how the cult's realism actually terrified him on a personal level. Like, even though he knew it was all scripted and he was ultimately in control of the storyline, watching his daughter go through that experience with The Undertaker in full Ministry leader mode genuinely made him fear for her safety on screen. The line between fiction and reality got blurred in a way that made Vince uncomfortable, which is saying something for a man who's seen and done everything in the wrestling business. The Ministry era remains one of the most controversial and talked about periods in WWE history, precisely because it pushed boundaries in ways that made everyone, including the boss himself, question how far was too far. And at the center of it all was The Undertaker, maintaining his dead man character so completely that even Vince McMahon couldn't help but feel genuinely unnerved. Up next, let's talk about another Orton now. Bob Orton Jr., the legendary Cowboy Bob, a veteran of the business who'd seen it all and done it all during his decades-long career. You'd think someone with that much experience would be impossible to intimidate, right? Not when The Undertaker is involved. In 2005, when Bob was teaming with his son Randy for that infamous casket burial storyline, Cowboy Bob found himself face-to-face with the Phenom during multiple promo segments and backstage encounters. Bob Orton Jr. admitted on Insight with Chris Van Vliet that he was genuinely afraid of The Undertaker during those promos, citing Taker's imposing 6'10" frame and that deadpan, emotionless delivery that made every word feel like a legitimate threat. Like, imagine being a veteran of the business, someone who's worked with all the legends and faced every type of opponent imaginable, and still feeling overwhelmed and intimidated by someone's presence. That's the effect The Undertaker had on people. It didn't matter how tough you were or how much experience you had. When Taker was in full deadman mode staring you down, something primal kicked in that made you genuinely uncomfortable. Bob's admission adds another layer to the Randy Orton storyline because it shows that even the father, who was there to support and protect his son, recognized that they were dealing with something beyond normal wrestling rivalry. The Undertaker represented something more dangerous and unpredictable, and both Ortons felt it. And finally, to round out our list, we gotta talk about Shane McMahon, Vince's son, someone who's never been afraid to take insane risks and put his body on the line for memorable moments. Shane McMahon. At WrestleMania 32 in 2016, Shane found himself in a Hell in a Cell match with The Undertaker, and the whole build-up was predicated on Shane trying to overcome this supernatural force through sheer courage and crazy high-risk maneuvers. The match culminated in Shane climbing to the top of the cell, preparing for that death-defying leap through the announce table. But right at that crucial moment, The Undertaker did his signature sudden rise from what should have been an unconscious state, causing Shane to pause in genuine stunned fear. McMahon family lore, as revealed through Vince's interviews, shows that Shane's nerves were real. He was already dealing with the very real fear of jumping from that height, and adding The Undertaker's unyielding supernatural presence to the equation made everything feel even more intense and dangerous. Shane's pause wasn't just selling for the cameras. There was legitimate hesitation as he processed both the physical danger he was about to put himself through and the psychological warfare that Taker was still waging, even at that late stage of his career. The match became legendary, not just because of Shane's insane bump, but because of how it captured the essence of what made The Undertaker special. His ability to instill genuine fear and second-guessing, even in the most courageous opponents. Shane overcame that fear and made the jump anyway, but that moment of hesitation told the whole story of The Undertaker's power. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, click on one of the suggested videos on your screen right now for more amazing content.